He taught generations to speak up, but in court they told him to stay silent. Jeremiah Cole stood up for his community when their homes were being erased, yet the judge refused to even let him finish a sentence. No lawyer, no microphone, just a voice trained to teach and a courtroom built to ignore it. What happens when a man who spent his life teaching justice is denied it himself? If this hits close to home like the video, share it with someone who still believes in fairness and subscribe for more stories that make you think. Let's walk into that courtroom together. It was supposed to be a routine civil hearing, the kind that comes and goes without notice. No headlines, no audience, just another case stamped and shelved. But that morning, when Jeremiah Cole stepped into courtroom 3B, the air felt heavy in a quiet, deliberate way, like the room already knew how things would end. He wasn't dressed like the others. No suit, no briefcase. Just a pale blue shirt neatly pressed, his late wife's church shoes polished the night before, and a folder worn soft along the spine. He wasn't a lawyer. He had spent 23 years teaching American government at South Willow High, the kind of teacher who made his students believe their voice mattered even when the world disagreed. Now, he was here not for himself, but for the community that raised him. Homes in South Willow were being bulldozed in the name of progress. The city called it revitalization. The neighbors called it disappearance. Jeremiah had come to stop it, or at least to make someone explain it out loud. The courtroom was sparse. A few city attorneys on one side, 2 people from the zoning board, and a reporter half listening from the back row. On the bench sat Judge Ronald Beckford, a man whose face didn't show doubt or patience, only certainty. Jeremiah stepped forward with quiet confidence. He greeted the court, laid out the case calmly, and began to walk through his argument. He cited property codes patterns in the city's zoning shifts and the sudden disappearance of South Willow from long-term planning maps. He spoke with the tone of someone used to explaining things clearly and being heard. But not today. Mr. Cole, the judge, interrupted. This court isn't here for a civics lesson. Jeremiah stopped mid-sentence. Not because he was surprised, but because the interruption was exactly what he expected. Still he nodded, adjusted his glasses, and resumed. He kept his voice steady. There was no anger. Just the same careful clarity he once used in a classroom full of teenagers who had never been told they mattered. A minute later it happened again. Mr. Cole. Judge Beckford said louder this time, "We are not going to entertain a lecture. Please stick to the facts, or I will have to end this." Jeremiah had not raised his voice. He had not stepped out of line. But something about the way he held the truth seemed to offend the room. The judge shifted in his chair and motioned toward the bailiff. Officer Kelly Brandt approached with a practiced walk and reached for the folder on Jeremiah's table. There was no warning, no question, just a quiet removal, as if the papers no longer mattered, as if the argument had never counted at all. Jeremiah looked at the folder, then at the officer's face, then at the judge, who no longer looked at him. The moment held its breath. "You're dismissed," Judge Beckford said. "This court isn't your classroom." Jeremiah didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He simply gathered his things, what little remained, and turned toward the doors at the back of the room. As he walked, there was no sound, no gasp, no whisper. Only the gentle creak of the courtroom's floorboards beneath his steps. No one said a word, not the attorneys, not the city officials, not even the clerk who had watched it all unfold. And just before he reached the door, Jeremiah paused. Not for long. Just enough to glance back at the bench, not at the judge, but at the space beside it, the one where fairness should have sat. He didn't come to win. He came to speak. And even if they hadn't listened, the silence they left behind was louder than anything he could have said. Some lessons don't end. They wait. And sometimes they echo harder the second time around. Outside courtroom 3B, the hallway stretched long and empty, its silence thicker than inside the room he had just been dismissed from. Jeremiah sat near the end, not slumped, not shaken, just still. He held the now crumpled folder against his chest, the papers inside loose from their bindings. They hadn't taken the whole thing, just enough to remind him it no longer belonged to him in there. He didn't look around. The hallway might as well have been a mile long. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Years of teaching had trained him to wait out noise, to hold a pause until someone leaned forward. But this pause was different. This one held no one on the other end. Just him. Just quiet. Just the sense that justice in that courtroom had never really taken its seat. A soft clearing of a throat broke the moment. It wasn't loud and it wasn't forced. It came from a man in a gray courthouse vest, sleeves rolled to the forearm, the kind of uniform you didn't notice until you needed something. Mr. Harris had worked at the county building longer than anyone remembered. He didn't speak often, and when he did, it was the kind of voice people leaned in for. He didn't sit beside Jeremiah. He just walked over and placed a thin form on the bench beside him. It was one sheet of paper printed in black and white. Title across the top read, Judicial Recusal Request, Local Division. No eye contact. No words of encouragement. He simply placed the form and stood for a moment, his hand gently tapping the edge of the page. Then he walked away. Jeremiah didn't pick it up right away. He knew what it meant. A formal motion to ask that a judge be removed from a case for cause. Rare. Rarer still to be approved, and nearly unheard of to be filed by a man without a law degree and without allies in the system. Filing it wouldn't change the judge's heart, but it would go on the record. And sometimes a record is the only place truth has to hide. He looked down at the form again, then back at the doors of courtroom 3B, and just then he saw her. Naomi stood near the entrance. She hadn't said she was coming. Likely snuck away from her shift at the library. She didn't speak, just stood there holding a brown paper bag in one hand and her jacket over the other arm, waiting for her father to look up. When he did, her eyes held his in that quiet way only daughters can manage. No judgment. No fear, but full of question. He gestured for her to come closer, and she walked over, sitting beside him on the bench. She handed him the sandwich, but he didn't open it. She asked softly, barely above a whisper, like she was afraid the walls might listen. "Why do you go back, Dad? When they don't listen?" He stared ahead for a long time. The question wasn't new, but coming from her it pressed deeper. Because he finally said giving up teaches them they were right. She didn't say anything else, and she didn't need to. He turned back to the form. The lines were small, the language rigid, but it wasn't complicated. He filled it out slowly with the same deliberate penmanship he once used to write recommendation letters for students who didn't think they had a shot. Line by line, he made his case. Not as a lawyer, as a citizen, as a father, as a man who knew what it meant to have to ask for fairness. When he finished, he stood up, walked down the corridor, and handed the form to the clerk on duty. The clerk glanced at it briefly, raised an eyebrow, then nodded. Jeremiah didn't wait for approval. He didn't expect applause. He simply stepped back from the counter, folded his hands behind his back, and exhaled. The next round would still be in that same courtroom, still under those same lights, still across from the same faces. But something had shifted. He wasn't there just to be heard anymore. He was there to be counted. When Jeremiah returned to courtroom 3B, it looked exactly as he had left it. Same judge, same bailiff, same fluorescent lights humming in their tired sockets. But now, there was one more piece of paper in the judge's folder. The recusal motion. He had filed it quietly without ceremony. It didn't carry legal footnotes or lengthy appendices, just a plain and measured request that Judge Beckford be removed from the case on the grounds of demonstrated bias and procedural disregard. There was no anger in the wording, no accusation, just clarity, and the belief that fairness ought to be something a man could still request even without a title before his name. The judge took no time. As soon as the court opened, he addressed the motion. "Mr. Cole's request for recusal is denied," he said without looking up. "The motion lacks legal substance, provides no admissible evidence of misconduct, and appears to serve only as a delay tactic." There was no pause. No invitation for a response. Beckford simply turned the page and moved on. Jeremiah did not flinch. He did not sigh. He only picked up his pen and began writing again in the margin of his notes. His face gave away nothing. But anyone watching closely could see it wasn't apathy. It was discipline. Behind him, Officer Brandt stood, silent hands clasped behind his back. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't intimidate by action. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a reminder that certain men were watched more closely in certain rooms. The prosecutor began to speak. Her tone was crisp, her words well-rehearsed. She cited city planning documents, fiscal projections, the alleged public benefit of redevelopment. She referred to the project as if it were already a success, as if the court's role was merely to formalize the narrative. Jeremiah kept writing. On the bench behind him, a woman in a green coat leaned slightly toward the man beside her. Her voice barely carried, but the words slipped through the stillness like a thread pulling at fabric. "He didn't even get a chance to be wrong," she said. The man didn't reply. But he looked up and toward Jeremiah the way someone looks when they recognize something they hadn't expected to see. The air in the courtroom shifted not in any dramatic way, but like a room that suddenly remembers its windows are closed. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace but from pressure. Beckford didn't acknowledge the moment. The prosecutor didn't notice it. But the clerk hesitated briefly before typing the next line into the record. The audience sat straighter. Even Officer Brandt blinked slower. The weight of the judge's denial didn't fall with a bang. It settled quietly over the room. Not because the words had power, but because the silence that followed them told a deeper truth. Jeremiah did not object. He did not argue. He let the denial stand. He let the stillness do the speaking. When the session ended, Beckford adjourned with a short nod. Papers shuffled. Shoes scraped gently against the tile. But no one rushed to the exit. They lingered. And in that quiet, lingering, something settled into the bones of the room. It wasn't justice, but it was the memory of someone asking for it. When the court reconvened after a brief recess, the temperature in the room felt different. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier. The kind of air that waits for someone to misstep. The clerk called the case back into session, and for the first time that morning, Jeremiah's name was spoken not as a problem, but as a party. He stood without hesitation, lifted his folder, patched together now with paper clips and fresh notes, and stepped back toward the table that had tried to reject him once before. There was no one beside him, no legal counsel, no paralegal whispering updates. Just him, just words. And if that courtroom had forgotten how potent words could be in the right hands, it was about to be reminded. Judge Beckford didn't look up right away. He adjusted his glasses, shifted in his chair, and tapped his fingers against the wood like he was waiting for Jeremiah to slip into something emotional, something easy to dismiss. But Jeremiah didn't raise his voice. He began with facts. He presented parcel numbers, referenced case precedents, quoted city zoning code section by section. He had marked each page with tabs made from torn pieces of a library receipt. His notes were handwritten but tight, intentional. There was no rambling, no stalling, only the sound of truth being laid out by someone who had lived beneath its absence for too long. He moved slowly but precisely, pointing out how the redevelopment notice had been filed after the environmental impact deadline. He highlighted signatures from city officials that conflicted across documents. He showed photographs of residents who had received eviction warnings without any official stamp or court approval. The city's attorney tried to object midway, but Jeremiah paused, turned slightly, and read aloud from the court's own rules of self-representation. Beckford allowed him to continue reluctantly. The judge's mouth grew tighter with each word, each citation, each line that had clearly not been expected to come from someone without a law degree. Then Jeremiah did something unexpected. He asked questions, not to the judge, not to the attorney, but to the courtroom itself. He turned slightly toward the spectators, toward the clerk, toward the reporters seated in the back, and he asked, "What does it mean when the law becomes convenient for the powerful but procedural for the poor?" There was no answer. Beckford cleared his throat sharply and ordered him to direct all comments to the bench. Jeremiah nodded, adjusted his papers, and turned back. But before he resumed, he said one more thing. The law should not be an accent reserved for those who were born into it. It should be a language taught to everyone. And today I am fluent enough. A few seconds passed before the room remembered to breathe. Officer Brandt shifted behind him. Just once. Not to intimidate, not to threaten, but because something about what had just been said had caused even him to lose posture. The city's attorney resumed her argument, but something about the rhythm had changed. She stumbled on dates, flipped the wrong page, and repeated herself once. Jeremiah said nothing. He let the record speak. The judge stared at his desk a little longer that day. His gavel sat untouched, and though no decision had been made, yet no ruling handed down, it was the first time since the proceedings began that Jeremiah left the floor with no one interrupting him, no one silencing him, no one treating his words as noise. He didn't win anything that morning. No headlines, no dramatic reversal. Just a small space carved out in a room that had long been too narrow for truth to sit beside dignity. And sometimes that's where the real victories begin. The morning had stretched longer than expected, and just as the judge was preparing to move the session forward, Jeremiah raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't insistent. It was the kind of gesture a student might make in a classroom quietly seeking space in a room that had already decided it was full. Judge Beckford hesitated. His fingers tapped twice against the edge of the bench before he exhaled. Briefly, he said, not meeting Jeremiah's eyes. Jeremiah stood calmly. He closed his folder, not as an end, but as a pause, and stepped to the front of the table. He didn't need to look around. His focus was already locked on the bench ahead. Before we move on, he began, his voice steady and low. I just need to ask one question. He waited a beat, not for effect, for clarity. Is it the content of what I say, or the color of who says it that unsettles this court? The stillness that followed was not silent in the usual way. It felt held like the breath of the room had been caught mid-thought and left there. The clerk froze with her fingers above the keys. The city attorney stiffened lips, slightly parted, as if unsure whether to speak or swallow. Even Officer Brandt, who had hardly blinked all morning, shifted his weight. Judge Beckford stared at his notes, but the muscles in his jaw gave him away. There was no answer he could offer that would not echo beyond the walls of that room. So instead, he reached for the gavel and brought it down hard. This session is recessed until further notice. He stood quickly, not bothering to wait for the formalities. Officer Brandt moved forward, not aggressively, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone whose job was clear. He stepped beside Jeremiah and gestured gently toward the door. There were no restraints, no confrontation, but the act said enough. You've said your piece. Now step aside. Jeremiah didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He gathered his folder, nodded once, and turned toward the rear of the courtroom. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if he was not leaving in retreat but in remembrance. He carried no triumph in his posture, no bitterness either, only resolve. As he passed the first row of benches, a woman halfway down the aisle rose slightly. Her mouth opened, maybe to speak or maybe to call out, but whatever words she carried never left her lips. She looked around, found no other face brave enough to meet hers, and sat back down. That silence rang louder than any outburst might have, because everyone in that room had heard the question, and no one, not even the judge, had dared to answer it. Jeremiah stepped through the doors without turning back. The bailiff resumed his post. The clerk returned to her seat. But the courtroom did not resume its rhythm. Something had changed in the air, even if no one would admit it aloud. Sometimes a courtroom is not just a space to weigh facts. Sometimes it is a mirror. And that morning, for a fleeting moment, it reflected something no one wanted to see. There was no ruling that day. No verdict handed down. But something far more lasting had settled in the room. A discomfort. A question. And a silence that no one could unhear. When the court resumed after recess, something in the room had shifted. Not the walls or the furniture. Not the judge or the bailiff, just the air. It carried the residue of a question still echoing, one that no one had dared answer. The clerk called the court to order. Judge Beckford returned to the bench, his face-tight posture forced into stillness. No one mentioned what had been said before the break, but it hung there. You could feel it in the way people avoided looking at one another. Then from the back row, a voice cut through the quiet. Your Honor, I request permission to speak under Section 43 of Observer Rights. Heads turned, even Beckford's eyes lifted. Emma Vance stood up. She wasn't dressed to make a statement. No designer suit. No performance. Just a dark blazer and the calm confidence of someone who had waited long enough. Beckford looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. State your name and role, he said. Emma Vance, she replied. Licensed attorney this state. Registration filed at the start of this session. I'm not representing either party. I'm submitting a document relevant to the court's ethical record. There was a pause, just long enough for Beckford's displeasure to register. You have 1 minute, he said. Emma stepped forward and handed an envelope to the clerk. Her voice was clear and steady. I used to sit in a different kind of room with Mr. Cole. I was 16. He was my civics teacher. He taught us how systems work. More importantly, he taught us how they sometimes don't. She didn't glance toward Jeremiah. She didn't need to. The document I submitted is a certified internal record from the state's Judicial Ethics Office. It contains 3 formal complaints filed against Judge Beckford over the last 8 years. Each complaint involves allegations of bias, procedural irregularities, and improper dismissals of self-represented litigants. None of them were investigated externally. All were closed administratively. The courtroom didn't react with gasps. No one shouted. But something shifted. Subtle. Immediate. Like a hallway light flickering when no one touched the switch. Beckford leaned forward. "These matters are not relevant to the case at hand," he said. Emma remained still. "They're not arguments," she replied. "They're records. I'm not here to debate them, only to place them where they belong." The clerk glanced up from her sheet, then at the envelope and back to Beckford. She didn't ask permission. She wrote something down and said quietly, "Filed." No one moved. Jeremiah, seated alone at his table, didn't turn around. He didn't speak. But slowly, just once, he dipped his head. A gesture that said more than thanks. A recognition. One teacher to one student. One truth to another. Emma returned to her seat. She didn't say another word. The courtroom didn't stir. No one clapped. There were no headlines, no sudden reversals. Just a file now heavier than it had been 5 minutes ago. A record that couldn't be deleted. A truth entered into the system by someone who had once been taught that justice wasn't something you memorize. It was something you carry. And for the first time that morning, the walls of that courtroom seemed just a little more human. The courtroom had just begun to settle again. Emma's words still lingered somewhere in the corners, and no one dared sweep them away too quickly. Judge Beckford adjusted his robe with practiced formality, like tightening something that had already begun to loosen. The clerk finished logging the previous submission and reached for the next file. Then a new voice, deeper and slower than the others, rose from the far end of the room. "Your Honor, I would like to request permission to submit a statement. I am not on the docket, but I believe the record will benefit from clarification." The judge looked up confused. So did the attorneys. Even Officer Brandt leaned forward. A man stood near the gallery doors. Gray shirt, thin glasses, hands folded around a slim briefcase that looked older than most of the furniture in the room. His name had not been called. He hadn't been announced. But when he stepped forward and said it, the recognition was immediate. "My name is Marcus Gentry. I served as a court clerk in this very room for almost 12 years. I retired 4 years ago. I am here today on my own." The silence in the room felt heavier than surprise. It carried weight, recognition, and something else. Beckford narrowed his eyes. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Gentry. You are not part of this proceeding." "I understand that," Marcus replied, calm and unshaken. "But this case connects to a ruling I was ordered to assist with 6 years ago. I believe the documentation I've brought today should be part of the court's consideration." He stepped forward slowly and handed a sealed folder to the clerk. She took it carefully. It was labeled by hand, neatly, deliberately. Beckford didn't interrupt, not because he approved, but because something in the room had shifted again. The control he had relied on was no longer guaranteed. Marcus turned to face the courtroom, then glanced briefly toward Jeremiah. 6 years ago, I was assigned to transcribe and log a decision related to a property rights dispute. The defendant was a woman named Rebecca Cole. The case was closed swiftly without testimony. I was instructed verbally and off record to adjust the case summary before it was filed, to omit key dates, and to reword the summary to make it appear the defendant had declined representation. That was not true. He paused only briefly. The judge who gave that order was Ronald Beckford. You could hear someone inhale sharply in the gallery, but still no one moved. "I followed that order," Marcus continued, "and I have not slept well since. I left the court a few years after. I tried to forget it. I failed." His voice didn't tremble. It wasn't the voice of someone trying to win anything. It was the voice of someone who had carried a silence far too long and had finally set it down. Beckford finally leaned forward. "These claims are personal recollections, unverified, not admissible." Before he could say more, Emma stood again. She spoke without raising her voice. "Your Honor, the documents Mr. Gentry submitted include the original unaltered case summary. It matches internal audit records from the Department of Federal Court Oversight cross-referenced 2 months ago under a separate ethics review. The digital signature on the metadata confirms the creation date. It predates the final filed version in this court's database. Beckford didn't respond. His lips pressed into a line. His hands did not move. The clerk looked at the folder she now held, then at the judge, then back at the page in front of her. She picked up her pen and began to write. No one needed to speak. The silence was enough. What had just been revealed was not dramatic in volume. It was devastating in substance. Jeremiah remained seated. His eyes never left the front of the room. He did not smile. He did not shift. But slowly he closed his eyes, and after a few seconds he opened them and gave a single nod. Not a gesture of triumph, not of relief, just a quiet signal that something had been restored. Not everything, but something. Not justice in full, but at least the truth. And for the first time, the truth was louder than the judge. The courtroom had just begun to settle again. Emma's words still lingered somewhere in the corners, and no one dared sweep them away too quickly. Judge Beckford adjusted his robe with practiced formality, like tightening something that had already begun to loosen. The clerk finished logging the previous submission and reached for the next file. Then, just past noon, a black government sedan pulled up to the courthouse steps. A man in a dark blue suit stepped out, walked briskly through the front doors, and without introducing himself to anyone, made his way directly to the clerk's bench. He carried a single envelope, cream-colored and sealed with a gold emblem that everyone recognized even before they could see it clearly. He spoke once in a calm voice that seemed to settle the room without raising its volume. "This is a federal notice of emergency review. Delivery confirmed by judicial dispatch protocol. Please present to the presiding officer immediately." The clerk took the envelope with both hands. For a moment she looked at it like it might burn her fingers. Then she stood, crossed the courtroom, and laid it carefully on the judge's bench without saying a word. Judge Beckford looked down at it, hesitated, then slowly broke the seal. His eyes scanned the page once, then again, then a third time. No one breathed. The judge set the letter down but did not lift his eyes. "As of this hour and by order of the United States Supreme Court, the Honorable Ronald Beckford is hereby suspended from active judicial duty, pending formal investigation into allegations of procedural misconduct, willful bias, and obstruction of justice." It was signed by Justice Evelyn Rhodes. A few in the courtroom looked up at the name, and one person smiled quietly to themselves. Justice Evelyn Rhodes had once sat in the front row of a public school classroom just blocks from the same neighborhood now under threat. She had been 17, serious and unsure of her place in the world, until a teacher named Jeremiah Cole had handed her a worn paperback copy of the Constitution and told her that understanding the law was one thing, but learning how to use it was something else entirely. Now she had used it. The room did not erupt, but the silence it left behind was not like before. It was heavier, final. Beckford sat still for several seconds. Then he leaned back slightly and folded his hands as if he were trying to hold on to something that was no longer there. He did not speak. He did not object. The clerk gently picked up the envelope and returned to her desk. Officer Brandt shifted. Not much. Just a step back, his arms lowering from their usual folded stance. He looked at the judge, then at Jeremiah, then away entirely. Jeremiah did not move. He looked down once, then slowly rose to his feet as the federal officer approached. The man offered no words, only a small gesture toward the table. Jeremiah followed his eyes. There beneath the table was the folder. His folder. It had been tucked away, pushed out of view sometime earlier, but it was still there. The officer bent down, retrieved it, and handed it over. The folder was worn now, the corners bent. One side had a tear along the edge where the clip had come loose. The papers inside had shifted, and some were wrinkled beyond repair. But it was still whole, still his. Jeremiah took it with both hands. He didn't look up, didn't speak. He simply rested his palm across the cover like someone checking the spine of an old book. Then quietly he drew it in close and stood still for a long moment. No one called the court to order after that. There was nothing left to say, no further evidence to present, only the quiet truth that something far above the courtroom had reached down and changed its shape. and the man who had once stood alone now stood in the same spot holding the one thing they had tried to take but could never erase. Courthouse had emptied slowly that day, not with urgency, but with the kind of reverence reserved for places that had witnessed something too quiet to be ignored. Outside, the air carried a stillness that didn't feel like defeat or even victory. It felt like a shift, as if something had moved beneath the surface of things, even if no one could yet name what it was. That night, in a small apartment just a few blocks away, a young woman sat cross-legged on the floor with a laptop balanced on a stack of old textbooks. Her name was Rena Taylor. She was a local reporter, barely 28, known for covering city budget meetings and school board elections. But years earlier, she had sat in a warm classroom with faded posters on the walls and listened to Jeremiah Cole explain what it meant to testify without needing a title. She had been there in the gallery that day, tucked behind a pillar, phone in hand, not expecting much. But when the judge cut Jeremiah off when the folder was seized, and when no one rose to defend him, she kept the camera rolling. She kept it rolling even when he walked out in silence, straight-backed eyes forward. She captured the moment he paused just before the doors closed behind him and how the room didn't breathe until he was gone. The clip was only 58 seconds long. No commentary, no editing, just a raw sliver of time that showed a man standing alone in a room designed to make him disappear. She uploaded it that evening. The caption was simple. He didn't win the court. He changed it. At first it sat there unnoticed like a stone in a river, but by morning it had caught a current. Teachers across the state began sharing it. So did veterans groups. A few law students picked it up, then legal reform pages. By noon it had crossed city lines. By dusk, it had crossed state lines. In online forums and under faded hashtags, people began to talk about what justice looked like when it wasn't wrapped in robes or echoed by gavels. They talked about what it meant to stand still when silence was mistaken for weakness. They didn't all agree on the politics, but they agreed on something deeper. They agreed that a man who refused to shout had said more in one look than some say in an entire career, and slowly things began to stir. A civil liberties group in Chicago opened a community roundtable called Courtroom Voices, inviting everyday citizens to share their experiences with local courts. A group of law students in Atlanta requested that judicial ethics be taught not only as theory, but as history, using real transcripts from Jeremiah's case. A small legal aid nonprofit in New Mexico rewrote their mission statement to include a single line, "Protect the silent." The video played on evening news segments. It was discussed, dissected, debated. But through all of it, one phrase stayed pinned to the top of almost every conversation. He didn't win the court, he changed it. It began to show up on classroom walls, on bumper stickers, in footnotes to opinion essays. Someone printed it on a coffee mug. Another etched it into the chalkboard of a neighborhood community center. And then from somewhere no one could quite trace, a small hashtag appeared. Stand quietly. It was not shouted, not trended by force. It just began to show up. At first in the corners of long blog posts or handwritten signs at town halls, then more boldly on banners at protests. Not in anger, but in presence. No one tried to claim it, not even Rena. It simply became the name for something people already recognized but had never named before. The power of stillness. The weight of dignity. The reminder that sometimes to not be loud is the most courageous thing a person can do. And so the man who had been told to leave the courtroom, who had walked out without saying a word, now found himself echoing through spaces he had never stepped into. Not because he had raised his voice, but because he hadn't. Some time had passed, not so much that people forgot, but just enough for the air to settle. The headlines faded, the hashtags slowed. The courthouse returned to routine. The doors still opened at 8. The clerk still called names in the same tone, but those who paid attention knew that something was different, not in how the building looked, but in how it listened. Jeremiah had not stepped into courtroom 3B since that day, but this morning he walked slowly down the same hallway, one hand brushing along the paneled wall as though tracing back a memory that had refused to be buried. Naomi walked beside him. She was taller now, straighter in her shoulders. Her pace matched his exactly. They reached the door, paused, then pushed it open. No one was inside. The benches were empty. The lights hummed quietly overhead. But what struck them most was the space itself. It felt the same yet entirely unfamiliar, like returning to a childhood home after years of weather and change. Jeremiah took a few steps forward, his eyes moving slowly across the room. Then they settled on the bench. The chair where Judge Beckford had once sat was still there, but no one occupied it. It stood vacant beneath a narrow shaft of sunlight coming in through the upper window, casting a warm line of light across the polished wood. That light had never reached the bench before. It had always stopped just short, but today it landed right where a person would sit if someone were there. Naomi looked up at her father and asked the question without hesitation. "Is it over now?" Jeremiah didn't answer right away. He stood for a moment, then walked closer to the bench, not to touch it, but simply to stand near it. "Maybe not for me," he said softly, "but maybe for someone next." Naomi said nothing. She followed his gaze. The two of them stood still as the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway behind them. Someone was approaching, though neither turned to look. Instead, they waited. A moment later, the door opened again. A young man stepped inside. He was dressed in black robes, his nameplate tucked under his arm. His face was calm, his eyes focused. He was tall, dark-skinned, barely 30. But there was something timeless in the way he moved. He didn't glance at the audience because there wasn't one. He didn't perform. He simply walked to the bench, paused for a breath, and sat down. The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. The bench was no longer empty. He looked straight ahead for a moment, then lowered his eyes to the desk before him, placing one hand gently atop it, almost like he was feeling its weight. Then, with the faintest of movements, he lifted his chin and gave a single nod. The light did not shift. The silence did not break. But something had begun again. And somewhere not far from the doors, a teacher stood quietly beside his daughter, watching hope take its seat. Sometimes a courtroom holds more than law. Sometimes it holds legacy. And in the case of Jeremiah Cole, it wasn't about winning a verdict. It was about planting something deeper, something that could outlive the silence and still be heard. This story reminds us that justice doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it walks out quietly and lets the world catch up. Sometimes change begins not with a shout, but with a steady breath and the courage to stand still. If this story moved you, please tap the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Your support means the world to us. It fuels our small team to keep creating stories that matter. Stories that shine light in overlooked corners. Stories that echo the power of dignity, resilience, and quiet resistance. Here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we believe in the power of remembered silence. Thank you for listening. Stay with us for more.